Hey everybody, welcome back to the fish tank and back to a very hot and sweaty London. Today we are going to go through one of my most requested videos ever, and that is going to be an introduction to Minion Masters deck building. That's right, deck building 101 here in the fish tank. So the idea of this video is to give you a good introduction to the kind of the mindset and the process that you want to go through when putting decks together. So without any further ado, let's start learning. Right, so as mentioned, deck building 101. Now every deck, just like every journey, starts with a single step. So we need a starting point on our deck building journey, and that can be one of many things. So for example, you could say, I want to build a deck around this master, and you choose the master, and then based on their perks and the way their perks interact with cards, then you build the deck accordingly. Secondly, you could choose to start with a specific mechanic. So things with mechanics like we're talking about Accursed Ascension, Outlander Tech, Stoutheart Revelry, things like that. And once you've decided on the type of mechanic you want to use, then you know the sort of cards and the sort of restrictions going for that mechanic will put on you. Now, another option is a hero card. So a hero card, say something like a Demon Warrior or a Shield Captain Surveyor. That could be your starting spot. And of course, the specific cards need certain things to support it, a certain sort of type of deck. For example, a cheap deck with Demon Warrior, although that may be changing in the next patch. Or the other thing could be a deck type stroke win condition. You might want to build an aggro deck, or you might want to build a control deck. So your starting point will be one or a combination of these things. Now, once you've made a decision, once you've got a starting point, then you also need to take into account some various considerations. So we've got a list of things here. So these are things to bear in mind when you're building your deck. And these things can be revisited, and deck building is really an iterative process. So that's either as you're building it, you're thinking about synergies, you're switching cards in and out, and you're making choices as you go along. But it's also iterative from the point of view of after you've played it. Once you've played it for a few matches, you've got some experience under your belt, you get an idea of how the deck plays, what it struggles against, what it's good against, and how you can potentially make it better. Right, so the first consideration is your master perk. So once you've decided what master you're going to use, you need to consider the perk and kind of the type of perk it is. So the things to consider are a cycle perk, where a card is added to your deck. So for example, we're talking about Rex perk, Ratbo's perk, something like that. Or a timer perk, perks that happen every so often, things like Diona or Apep. And the reason that's important is a cycle perk wants you to have a cheaper deck as possible to get through to that perk as often as possible and to get as much value out of it, whereas a timer perk doesn't matter. So if you're building a deck with a master that's cycle based, then you want to keep in mind that your deck will want to be cheaper than more expensive from the point of view of getting your perk out as often as possible. Now, the next thing is the master and card synergy. So we think about things that work together. So if you started off with your master, so for example, you say, I'm going to make a Stormbringer deck, you know Stormbringer synergizes really well with ranged minions. Or if you build with Ratbo, then you know it synergizes really well with Horde and Setsu and Milloween with spells, etc, etc. And one thing to note is that these considerations, they don't have to all be done in this order, because you know you might not decide on what master you want to choose until right at the end of the deck building process. You might have your 10 cards and then you think, oh, what master goes well with this? And then once you've chosen a master, then you might start thinking about which cards don't synergize so well with that master. And that's kind of an example of the iterative nature of this process, where you're constantly making decisions, and then based on that decision you may want to change things as you go further forward. Now, we spoke about cycle based masters wanting a cheaper deck. Now we're probably going to look for an average deck cost between 3 and 4.5 mana. Now, if you've watched any of my recent Minion Masters meta videos, you'll see that pretty much regardless of the game mode, the decks are between 3.5 and 4 mana on average. Now, one thing to note is that the really cheap decks, the super cycle decks, they are not really beginner friendly because you've got lots of very cheap cards and you have to use them really, really efficiently to deal with sometimes much more expensive and powerful opponents. So really, really cheap cycle decks, not for the beginner, not for the faint-hearted. Right. Next up, we have hard counters to your strategy. So you've got to be thinking about, once you've decided on your deck and your setup, think about what you're going to struggle against. And not only what you're going to struggle against, but how you could overcome that. So, for example, if you're playing a deck with lots of big minions, you've got to think, oh, if my opponent has a lightning bolt or a wizard puff, something like that, that's going to be difficult for me to deal with. So how would I deal with that? So for an example is you may put some, depending on the deck and the master you're playing, you may put some Horde in there to give you protection against things like the lightning bolts. If you're playing a melee heavy deck, then you've got to be thinking about, if my opponent has a Defenso, that's going to be really difficult for me to deal with. What is my suggestion about dealing with that? Maybe run an Arcane Bolt, for example. So you've got to have thought process in mind of what you're going to struggle against, and you might not necessarily, during the deck building phase, immediately identify what you're going to struggle against, but as you try the deck out, you may find things that really do hard counter you, and then again, back to the iterative process, is you start making changes. You may like change a spell that you're running that deals better with these things that hard counter you, for example. Right, next up we have choosing between similar cards. So there's Minion Masters has like 270 plus cards in it, and inevitably there are numerous cards that are fairly similar. But how do you choose between similar cards? Well, sometimes you've got to think about what synergies the cards will have with what you already have. So for example, if you're thinking, oh, do I want to go with Plasma Marines or Crystal Archers? Well, if you have something in your deck that is using Outlander tech, then straight away you're going to go, well, I'll probably want the Plasma Marines for that Outlander tech generation. And then, for example, if you're choosing, do I want Scrat Horde or a slightly more tanky and more expensive Skeleton Horde? Well, if you're playing, for example, Wrecked or King Puff, then these masters will get buffs from cards 4 plus up to 7, I think. So if you're playing those masters, you might choose the more expensive Skeleton Horde to get the master synergy bonus. Right, and then we have avoid brick hands. Now, this means really just looking at your deck and thinking, what's the worst hand I could have? What's the worst set of 4 cards at any particular time I could have? And that's something that's, depending on the type of deck, sometimes is a little inevitable. And that's just a necessary evil, depending on the sort of deck you're playing. So, for example, we know there's some real cheesy Colossus decks. Sometimes they have really awkward hands when they open up and you see they just throw a hill ball on your face, for example. That's just an example of a brick hand. You know, you want to avoid it if possible, but sometimes it is, as mentioned, a necessary evil. And one thing I should have mentioned earlier, but I didn't, but I will now, is a big thanks to DeathShoot and to Memfisto for giving me their input and helping me put together this guide. Some very, very experienced top-level players, and it's always good to get their input on things like this. So thanks to them, and sorry for not mentioning it earlier. Right, so these considerations are things to take into mind. And then kind of building on considerations is a list of things of what your deck can deal with. And if it can't, then you know you've got to decide either adjusting your deck to deal with these things, or you just accept that you're just going to have a bad time in these situations. So these are the things that I think it's really important to keep in mind. So things like, how do I deal with a heavy, high DPS single target melee like a Cleaver? So there's lots of decks that will struggle against things like a Cleaver, but if you have like a Jolo or lots of Horde, stuns, then you can deal with a cleaver. Whereas if you've got lots of sort of mid-range, mid-mana tanky units, then you might struggle to deal with a thing like a cleaver. And then kind of building on that, something like a high DPS AoE melee. So AoE stands for area of attack. So that just, or area of effect. And that means that instead of it just hitting one thing like the cleaver, the Colossus obviously has that big cleave attack that hits many things. So that makes it more difficult to deal with, or at least it requires a different type of response. So a lot of new players will definitely struggle, I think, against the Colossus, for example. But once you understand how it works, and of course all units have their strengths and their weaknesses, so you've got to understand its weaknesses, and you just start tanking it with a cheap unit, keeping it pointing away, keep your DPS around it or behind it or spread out around it, and everything can eventually be dealt with. We spoke about how really cheap decks earlier are not for the faint-hearted. So for example, if you've got a really cheap deck and then you come up against someone playing like a Colossus, then that's going to take a lot of skill with regards to using the right card, positioning as well, utilizing your master attack and things like that. And that's where the real skill of those super cheap decks comes in. Right, next up is a long-range unit. So if your opponent has snipers, for example, how will you deal with that? Now, there's obviously two ways of dealing with ranged units. You either get on top of them, whether that's you push into them, or you wait for them to come to you, or you have a removal spell. So a lot of decks will have removal spells, and you've got to be thinking about your removal spell. Is it a single sort of damage spell? And what by that I mean like a fireball that does its damage all in one hit. And of course that can be prevented by shields. Or do you have a poison strike, for example, or a Bearvalanche, or something that just does damage over time? So shields are not going to affect that. And that's one thing we see with newer players. They do struggle against these ranged units. For example, the Harbinger recently got kind of a rebalance, but it was supposed to be a nerf for newer players to deal with it more easily because of the way it was slow and it loitered and it really punished you if you played into it. Right, next up we have an anti-melee unit. So if you have a heavy melee based deck, how will you deal if your opponent has a defenso chopper, for example? So keep that in mind. Next up we have Swarm. What are you going to do if your opponent has a lot of Swarm? Do you have stuff that can deal with that, like a Blastmancer or a Defenso Chopper, Whirly Scrat? And of course, not only do you have to think about ground-based Swarm, you've got to also think about airborne Swarm. And then finally, air units. So we spoke about the Harbinger. So the air units do need a different type of approach to deal with them, especially things that are very long range. So for example, we've got these 6 options here, but some units fall into multiple of these options. So Harbinger is an air unit, it's also a long range unit, so you know that's kind of a double whammy there. Again, air unit and Swarm propeller scrats, they will require a specific approach. So yeah, keep this in mind, how you would deal with these. Your deck doesn't necessarily have to deal with all of these, but you've just got to understand what weaknesses you might have, or what ways you can deal with things if you do come up against them. And one of the further thoughts, if you're getting a little bit deeper into it, you've got to pay attention to the meta. That's kind of the overall playstyle, the overall sort of more popular units that are being played at your level. That's the important thing, because the meta will be different depending on what level you are at the game. Some things are very powerful earlier on, whereas lots of different things are powerful at the top level. So pay attention to the meta. For example, you might just say, well, you know, my deck's not great against a Harbinger, but I barely ever see a Harbinger, so let's just roll the dice with that one. Okay, so that's a bunch of considerations to keep in mind. Now, going all the way back to the start, one of the starting points was a deck type, or also a win condition. And what we're going to look at here is, I think, 5 specific deck types, stroke win conditions, And then we're going to have a look and kind of give you a bit of a framework of how you can build decks towards that win condition. So we've got the aggressive win condition, and that is pretty much where you just really want to push early and ultimately kill your opponents through multiple pushes. So you're going to be wanting to do damage each time you push, and then eventually that's going to be too much damage and you're going to win the game. And then another example is the all-in rush aggressive. So that's sort of taking aggressive to the next stage where you just want to win with one giant push. So you've seen a lot of these Ravager decks, they get their perk 1 Brutus out, and then they kind of have that great big push at that moment. And the Ravager deck's kind of interesting because it has those sort of two main parts of the game. You've got that all-in rush at perk 1, and then again at perk 3. So you've got those two big opportunities to win. And often if you don't win by that perk 3, then you're probably going to lose. Right, next up we have the fairly common control deck. So the idea of the control deck is you ultimately want to win through Mana Frenzy. That is your game plan. You're going to get to Mana Frenzy first, and then you're going to be able to hold the bridges and get that extra mana. So remember, in Mana Frenzy, the XP that you get from bridges or any other sources will turn into mana. So Mana Frenzy, hold bridges, get more mana, win. So that's kind of the control mindset. Then we have the defensive. So this is going to be something where you play defensively, but ultimately you're going to be getting some more value in the late game or the longer game as the game goes on. And we'll see some examples of these decks in a minute, so that hopefully they'll all make a little bit more sense. And then the late game, these are decks that really scale into the late game. So things like a Demon Warrior or a Future Presence deck, something like that. And so yeah, those are the sort of the 5 overall deck type stroke win conditions. And of course, once you've decided on which one of these you want to go down, then it gives you a bit of structure as to how to build your deck around it. And depending on how you build the deck, the interesting way, sort of the deck building is you can start in loads of different places. And your win condition deck type, it might not be something that you specifically choose, but based on the master and the deck you've built out, by the time you've made it without even thinking about your win condition, you're like, oh, I made an aggro deck, or oh, it looks like this is a control deck. So it might not be something that you specifically choose, but it's something that you really should keep in mind. Right, so let's have a look at these examples. So we're going to look at the decks that we just spoke about, the deck types, and we're going to give you sort of a framework as to how to put something like this together. Right, so aggressive deck. I want to win with repetitive pushes that continuously barrage my opponent, eventually killing them. So what do we want to make a deck out? Right, so you want a key push unit, 2 of those. You want effective spell support, 3 of those. You want cycle stroke split bridge grabs, 3 of those. Cheap AoE stroke range. And of course, this is just an idea. You don't have to be fully held within this framework. You can use it as a guide and then change it as you see fit. So let's have a look at an example. So here we have a rec deck. And then what we're going to do is we're going to colorize the different bits so we can see exactly which part of the deck goes for which of those. So we've got key push units. We've got a couple of big tanky units. We've got the Zealots and the Shieldguard of Light. We've got our effective spell support in the form of Unholy Ground, Bearvalanche, and Chain Lightning. We've got our cheap cycle split bridge grabs, Swarmers, Marines, and we've got the Skeleton Horde. And then we've got some cheap AoE and ranged in the state of a Grenadier or a S.T.INT. So there's an example. And what I'll do, I'll put all these decks in the description. So if you want to try them out, use these as a starting point potentially, and then build off, then you can do that, of course. Okay, so that's the aggressive deck. Next up, we have the all-in rush. Now, there are a couple of versions of this. We're going to have a look at a spell-based version and a minion-based version. So these decks tend to be very imbalanced. They have lots of weaknesses, but they have also lots of strengths. And these are the kind of decks, as we spoke about, having a brick hand, a really awkward hand. This is where you tend to find these bad hands most likely. Okay, so let's have a look. So the first thing we want is a VIP giant card to push with, one of those. We want 4 combat spells for removing the defense, 3 support spells for the push, the cycle control spells, or cheap split units. Remember, this is the spell-based version of this. Milloween, of course, did receive some changes recently, so these decks may or may not be as strong as they used to be. Remember, the golem can't hit air, so let's just colorize these to make it easy to see. So we've got the giant card to push with, the Colossus. We've got combat spells, 4 of those. We've got the Scratillery, Chain Lightning, Unholy Ground, and Vortex. We've got some support spells. We've got the Sugilite Shield, and we've got the Impetus Blast, as well as the Heal. And then we've got some cheap spells or cheap units we've got 2 of those. So we've got the Crystal Archers and the Ravenous Swarmers. Ravenous Swarmers, of course, really do super DPS when they're triggered by using the spell previous. So that's an all-in rush deck, the spell-based variety. Next up, we have the all-in rush, but the minion-based variety. So we want 3 powerful stroke fast-paced minions. We want 3 combat stroke support spells, and we want 4 cheap medium cost units. And of course, as you could probably guess, this is going to be a Ravager deck. So let's have a look at those. So we got our fast, powerful units in our minions, which we've got our Doom Cleaver, we've got our Rammer, and we've got our Brutish Betrayer. Now, we also have 3 combat support spells, which we've got the Shock Rock, we've got the Sunburn, and we have the Dragon Ball. And then we've got some cheap stroke medium cost units in the Swarmers, the Crystal Archers, the Ravenous Swarmers again, and finally the Succubus. So that's the all-in rush strat, but this is the minion-based rather than the spell-based, and of course that gives you an idea of the sort of master you want to use it with. Right, next up we have the control deck. These are very common. Some people love them, some people hate them, but the win condition here is to get to Mana Frenzy, to control the battlefield, to get to your perks first, and to get to the Mana Frenzy first, and ultimately to win through that. Right, so we want some high versatility spells, a couple of those, reliable potent DPS cards, a couple of those, cheap cycle stroke split units include AoE, 5 of those, and we want 1 main ranged unit. Right, and as you would expect, APEP is the control master. Okay, so let's colorize these. So we got our high versatility spells. So we've got the Bearvalanche and the Chain Lightning. One thing to bear in mind is think about the limitations that spells have. Bearvalanche can only hit ground. Chain Lightning can hit everything, so they kind of work well together. We've got our reliable, potent DPS cards. We've got the Assassin and the Flame Imp. We've got our cheap cycle split units, including AoE. So we've got the Elite Swarmer, Grenadier, S.T.INT, and the Scrap Pack, along with the Plasma Marines. And we've got our main ranged unit, which is our Aimbot. So you can see we've got lots of little units that can help us take bridges. And we've also got some great DPS to deal with threats. Now, Control, of course, wants to take the bridges, so you've really got to build around the bridges and think about cards that can utilize bridges. These are, of course, just examples, but think about cards like the Walking Blind Date, the Wrecked Walker, for example, if you want other ways of taking bridges. We've got the S.T.INT in here, which of course has its tech-based bridge grab ability. One of the things you'd have to do with this deck is you'd have to balance what you're spending your tech on. Do you want to use the bridge grab, or do you want to empower your aimbot, for example? Right, next up, the defensive deck. So this is kind of designed, you're really mostly only worrying about what's going on your side of the field. So this is a defensive strat, but it's going to give you a payout later in the game or just additional value throughout the match. So we want a VIP defensive card. We want 3 defensive cards, cheap medium cost AoE, reliable medium stroke high damage spell, one of those, and 3 cheap medium cost split units. Okay, so this is what we're talking about here is something like a bridge shrine. So the bridge shrine, of course, will give you double that XP from the bridge that you have. So you want a lot of units that will allow you to keep pressure on that bridge and to hold that bridge. Right, so our VIP defensive card is the Defenso Chopper, always a good call. Defensive cards, depending on like what sort of deck you're doing, you might have also something like Swarmer Totems, just spawner buildings. But we've gone for the Bridge Shrine here. We've got a Wall and Sapphire Pebbles in there. We've got our medium cheap cost AoE, the Grenadier, the Rocket Scrats. We've got the Bearvalanche, our medium high damage spell. And we've got our cheap medium cost split units in the Scrat Pack, the Swarmers, and the Spear Throwers. So, you know, this is really just designed to keep pressure on that bottom bridge. Once you have a Bridge Shrine, then all you need to do really is hold one bridge, because if you have one bridge and your opponent has one bridge and your bridge is supported by a Bridge Shrine, you're getting twice the XP that they are. So one bridge each with a Bridge Shrine is fine. If you can hold both of them as well, then great, but you don't want to be greedy. Right, next up we have our late game deck. So these are decks that are going to be inefficient early on, but the longer the game goes on, the better they're going to be. So these are things like the Demon Warrior, the Shield Captain Avea, the Future Past Present, things like that. So our VIP card that we're going to build around, 3 defensive cards, cheap stroke medium cost AoE, a couple of those, reliable medium high damage spell, one of those, and some cheap medium cost split units, 3 of those please. Right, so again we're looking here at an APEP deck, and this is a Shield Captain Avea. So Shield Captain Avea will be weak early doors, and stronger once you've got her activated. She of course has her quest, I want to say mission, but her quest to shield other units, and once she's got that activated, then she'll get all her Legionnaires. And depending on the version that you're going for, it will affect some of your decisions. So the Demon Warrior deck, as it is at the moment, would probably need to be cheaper than this because it takes a lot longer to get activated. But again, that's something that's likely to change in the next patch, where the Demon Warrior only needs 4 cycles, but will only be twice as big. Right, so we've got our VIP card. This is the card we're building around, Shield Captain Avea. Now we've got our defensive cards. We've got the Elite Swarmer, the Wall, and the Aimbot. And then we've got some cheap medium cost AoE in the form of a Grenadier and an Arcanist. So that's a nice combination there, because we've got the Grenadier ground-based AoE, the Arcanist as anti-air as well as ground-based. We've got our reliable medium high damage spell, which is the Beam of Doom. Often see the Beam of Doom used in these cheap decks, as it's really allows you to cover your weaknesses. And then we've got our medium cheap split units. We've got the Scrap Pack, the Swarmers, and the Plasma Marines. So we've got some tech in here with the Aimbots, so the Plasma Marines are definitely the call here. Okay, so that is the late game deck building. Right, so as mentioned, I will put all of those decks in the description, so if you want to check those out, you can do. But hopefully that gives you a good idea, good introduction to deck building, the process, the mindset, things you want to keep in mind, and how you can get the best out of this. As always, let me know in the comments, what do you think about this guide? And also let me know any decks that you've built. Share your decks, let us have a look at them, let us know how you're getting on. Always good to see, and hopefully this should be good for players of all abilities. And of course, this is just a guide. Once you really get into it, you get into your own sort of thought process, your own pattern of doing things, but this should be a great place for people to start out with. If you're enjoying the content, as always, make sure you hit the subscribe button, give us a like. We are the home of Minion Masters here on YouTube. My name's Bad as a Fish, and I'll see you again soon here after this awkward wave.